listening to episode 128 of Mitolife Radio. I'm Matt Blackburn, and today I have Keith Littlewood returning to the show, aka Tomo Littlewood, as he's known on social media. And he's here to talk about the thyroid harming effects of environmental pollutants. Keith has a Master's of Science degree in endocrinology, so he is focused a lot on the thyroid gland and all of the different aspects of it. And I like his approach in studying environmental pollutants because a lot of these, we've often heard of xenoestrogens and synthetic estrogens in the environment, but there's so much more. There's gases in the air, and the heavy metal exposure is really off the charts. And aluminum, cadmium, mercury, these actually affect the mitochondria and every tissue and gland in the body, especially the thyroid gland, which Keith calls the master gland of the body. So this was a really fun show. I learned a lot. I always take notes when I talk to Keith, and I think you'll get a lot out of it. Enjoy. Keith Littlewood, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me, Matt. Good to see you.
Yeah, we're going to talk about environmental pollutants today, and this is actually part of what got me into natural health, because a lot of people just get into diet and nutrition and jumping on a specific diet, and that's their introduction to alternative health. But I remember like looking at my deodorant and saying, oh, titanium dioxide, and looking at my shampoo and the conditioner and just the shower water and all these little factors that like bioaccumulate over years. And that kind of made sense to me that that's causing a lot of illness.
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why I kind of started pursuing thyroid physiology. And I never set out to do this. I kind of, as you know, I was kind of more of a physical therapist to start with. And then I did some functional medicine stuff and some holistic nutrition, which kind of got me preaching all sorts of garbage. And then it was kind of reading Ray's work before I got into more studying endocrinology proper. And that's what's kind of motivated me to look at some of the other aspects around thyroid physiology. Because as you know, I think thyroid, I think to quote Atom Birdstrong, actually, who says that the thyroid is the master gland. And I think there's some mileage behind that. And especially if we can perhaps not restrict, but keep a minimal amount of function coming from the hypothalamus and the pituitary, stimulating these kind of backup mechanisms. And it becomes clear that those backup mechanisms are often distorted when you have an abundance of pollutants. And if thyroid physiology is off, then perhaps all other aspects of physiology are off as well. And it's I've looked at hundreds and hundreds of papers. I've skimmed thousands of papers. I skimmed about 5,000 papers in the last 6 months and looked at a couple of hundred in depth as part of a literature review. And there's some really interesting manifestations of different aspects of thyroid disruptors, which also have a very significant effect on, say, the androgen receptors, the estrogen receptors, glucocorticoid and other receptors. And they work at very different levels. So it could be working at the thyroid gland itself, as an example. So where a certain pollutants, particularly things like the polythiourouracil, which inhibits the thyroid, which is a medicine, and then other kind of compounds like that, which restrict the amount of conversion of iodide and tyrosine into the molecules that form T4. So you'll get various different stages within the gland, which is like organification, trapping, coupling, iodination, intrathyroidal deiodination as well. So you get these components where T4 is actually restricted. And then that, therefore, the gland itself will be more prone to getting stimulated from the pituitary by producing more of thyroid stimulating hormone, which has almost like a bodybuilding effect on the thyroid because it's not producing enough. Sometimes there can be interactions with like selenium, iodine, magnesium, zinc, and certainly the selenoproteins can be affected by other things like heavy metals and such. So there's the thyroid gland, then there's the transport, thyroglobulin, which is in the thyroid gland, then transthyretin and thyroid binding globulin and albumin can also have kind of displacement effects. And for example, even abundance of fatty acids can displace T4 from binding to these thyroid binding proteins. And that's one of the major kind of actions of some of the pollutants, that they restrict the binding of T4 to most of these carrier proteins. And then, the effect of T4 binding at its receptor site, as an example. So you'll have this inhibitory effect where T3 then can't bind to the receptor as well. And there are a few pollutants that actually mimic the kind of structure of thyroid hormone and will bind in that receptor space. So it can antagonize it, can almost like it have a similar effect. And there are pollutants that have both have an agonistic effect and an antagonistic effect. So you then get kind of broad disruption to gene transcription as well. So it's not just happening at a singular level. There are multiple levels of dysfunction, as it were. And then you have the feedback loop. And there are also many pollutants, as an example, that stop the production of thyroid releasing hormone at the hypothalamus, and then stop the production of thyroid stimulating hormone. And again, another example is the deiodinase enzyme. So most of the T4 to T3 conversion takes place via these enzymes, and these tend to be restricted or sometimes upregulated or downregulated or just blocked. And this is where you can see all of these pollutants having a significant effect, which I find fascinating, because it just lends more credence to the idea that a thyroid blood test can be a complete waste of time, which we've talked about before. And also, one of the other mechanisms, it also can speed the degradation. So at the liver, as an example, you'll get increased glucuronidation and sulfation, which basically degrades T3. I mean, first of all, it happens, via perhaps an increase in what's called D3 or deiodinase 3. And that breaks that down, increases this kind of excretion at the liver. So you have all these kind of effects where thyroid hormone is just decimated. And each kind of class of pollutant seems to have a significant effect. And then multiple mixtures have different effects. And when you think there are 70,000 or 80,000 odd man-made chemicals out there, it's still difficult to kind of assess all of those at any given time to see the effects. And not to go on too much about it, I think one of the problems that, particularly at like the Europe, I think it was the EPA, and then you've got is it the Environment Protection Agency in the US?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
A lot of the studies they've done before have actually found to be probably quite ineffectual at kind of depicting what is an appropriate dose. And there's a term called non-monotonic effects, which basically, instead of where you keep applying a higher dose and you would expect to see more restriction, actually these doses are having much more potent nefarious effects at very low dose, even perhaps lower than previously tested doses to exert this effect. So, it's crazy what can happen.
That was great. Yeah, you bring up so many great points. The toxicological synergy is kind of scary. And I like to think like people are intentionally like taking pharmaceutical medications, like, 5, 10, 15, 20, plus the kind of like unintentional, unknown pollutants that are coming through their personal care products and their water supply. And maybe they're using like crappy little air filters that they sell at Costco that pump out poisons. And who knows the effects, right? I mean, it's kind of just affecting every system, and it's no wonder why everyone's dealing with a chronic illness.
Yeah, and you only have to go to a shopping mall. I mean, I live in a land where they've got the biggest shopping malls in the world, and you just go in there and the smells, even if you not even just going to the bathroom, if you just go off to, say, just walking around, some of the chemicals that are already in the air have an endocrine disrupting effect. And there are studies that have looked at that within the mall. So the capacity through inhalation, bearing in mind we're not even talking about being, outdoors inhaling combustion fumes, diesel fumes, wherever there are factories that have the perfluoroalkyls, the PFOAs and PFOSs, which have shown to have very catastrophic effects on thyroid function. And, they get into the water tables, and like some of the other pollutants like atrazine, they all combine and have an effect. So inhalation, absorption, digestion, all of these factors come into play. And it can be a scary thought. I've often thought about if we could have, you wouldn't want it because I hate over metricization anyway, but you literally had a counter for each chemical that had come into contact with your body and been absorbed. So it might be the fluoride in the toothpaste, another potent thyroid inhibitor, might be the skincare regime, it might be the source of water. And that's not to say, hey, look, we're not trying to scare people, because you can create that element of fear and it becomes so overwhelming that you don't know what to do about it. But what we're trying to say is be aware of the things that you can perhaps manage, and you can create a much more robust body and deal with the stimulus rather than being overwhelmed. And when your physiology does become overwhelmed, that's when you become overwhelmed about all the stresses around you, rather than seeing them as opportunities for discovering how to overcome them.
Yeah, great point. You don't have to go off grid like I did, move to the mountains, just making small steps, just the things that you can. Like I was thinking the other day, like aspirin and antihistamines like Benadryl that can have beneficial effects. Most of the time people have like a negative stigma because of the excipients and like the other ingredients list, where you have like dyes and colorings and titanium dioxide. And that's probably why people think these are just blanket bad. Any medications are bad and they're unnatural, because they're looking at those crappy brands. Like I only use like Gericare aspirin because it just has cornstarch.
I think both of those things that you've just talked about, and we kind of briefly talked about, why antihistamines can be really, really useful for resetting someone. And I remember reading in Ray Peat's Mind and Tissue book originally about the concept of inhibition and recuperation, which I think I kind of bastardized, and I realized I called it something called recuperative inhibition, which I still quite like because it gets the point across, but that you can kind of, instill better quality sleep by shutting down the system. And I remember in his book, he talked about how perhaps there are two levels of inhibition. There's a more organized level of inhibition, and then there's a lower level, which is kind of associated with so much fatigue, it potentially leads to death. But then there's a higher state that's kind of more organized. And that kind of ties quite nicely into aspirin, because I remember reading about listening to Gerald Pollack's interview from On the Back of a Tiger just recently, which I hope will come out soon, because what he's saying about corruption in science is really quite relevant at the moment. But I digress slightly. But he talks about how aspirin kind of has very structuring of water effects. So for anybody who's kind of looked at, say, Gilbert Ling's work and the idea of, structured water, coacervates, proteins and gels. And I think Ray kind of alludes to that in Mind and Tissue, where he talks about the organization of a cell and the structure. And aspirin can have that effect as well, where inhibition is almost associated with a relative rigidity of a structure, but it's organized and it's less permeable and it doesn't let loads of stuff in and out. Whereas, when we've looked at, say, stuff, even looking at, say, omega-3s, when they get saturated at the membrane, as an example, they make that membrane much leakier. So when you actually kind of have this organized level of inhibition, you actually get more structure and you get more organization at the so-called perhaps outer border, what some people call the cell membrane, or some people might just call the protein interfaces that have a certain amount of lipids and proteins and interact with water as well. And I think aspirin and red light have that organizing effect, which help with inhibition. And to the extent that you can get better sleep by using some of the antihistamines, but it's a great point. Some of them have very nasty things in, like promethazine, which I've used before, has titanium dioxide in, which you don't want to be taking on a long-term basis. And I think that some of the pink dyes and the artificial sweeteners that you get in, say, Benadryl, as an example, great. I mean, we need to be aware of those things, but don't be scared to use them for a very short period of time. Because sometimes some people just need that night or two sleep just to get that level of recuperation, right? And you get a certain amount of inhibition. And I think it also ties into another point, that you need adequate energy for that as well. There's no point in trying to take all these things if you're not working the foundation. And I've had some people go, well, that periactin or cyproheptadine hasn't worked that well, and they have an underlying thyroid issue. And if you have that, sometimes if you're trying to restrict, say, serotonin and your thyroid's still not working efficiently, your ability to organize glucose responses are going to be poor. So inhibiting sleep is going to be great, but you're probably going to find you still wake up because you don't have the adequate glucose and energy available to maintain deep phase REM sleep. But yeah, I think that they're valid points for sure.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. Yeah, I just saw a video that Josh Rubin put up on YouTube about TTP, like transthyretin protein, and how it needs retinol, like vitamin A,
Yeah,
to be
absolutely.
transported from the thyroid to the liver. And like, if people aren't eating enough eggs or cheese or butter or milk, I mean, that's like more foundational than taking something, right?
Yeah, no, transthyretin does bind with retinoid binding protein, and they also have a synergistic effect with the receptors. So the thyroid receptor is usually bound with the retinoid. It's called the retinoid X receptor, and they have this. There's this kind of level of the nuclear family receptors where I think there was 7 of them, the so-called transmembrane receptors, and it probably doesn't give us all of that we need to know about perhaps membrane physiology and function, and differences between genomic and non-genomic effects, because they're kind of slightly different. But yeah, there's definitely this synergy with the retinoid binding proteins and the retinoid X receptors. And interestingly enough, that pollutants also exert that negative effect as well. They can inhibit the effects of the retinoid X receptor. And another one, they also kind of stimulate something called the pregnane X receptor and the aryl hydrocarbon receptor, that then start this cascade of where you'll probably need more thyroid because that's being degraded, and also perhaps more vitamin A as well, because that could be restricted as well. So there's a synergy there from proteins to kind of receptors, and it's quite remarkable about perhaps the level we can go to. And sometimes I have to remind myself of some of the molecular stuff, which kind of totally detracts from the ability to help someone, but it is important from the studies. But there's no point in saying about molecules and stuff. And I was reminded by a quote by Dennis Noble the other day. He said, if we were just to look at molecules, there would be no purpose in the body, because literally everything's all the same anyway. So it doesn't help to get too reduced, and it certainly doesn't help me coach people to get better sleep, nutrition, fertility, and thyroid function, as an example. But yeah, that's a valid point as well.
So when you coach people, do you like try to find their weakest link? Like, where do you start with people? You just kind of like take a inventory of their EMFs and like how they're living?
So I think I always go through a process first of all, and the first thing is talking about food, because you can be doing all of those things, and the very basic thing is energy intake. And you'll always still see a bunch of people talk about healthy diets, and it's usually the people that have been the healthiest and the most restrictive who are having lots of the problems. Sure, you can overeat, and again, overeating certain foods can have a significant effect on thyroid binding to these thyroid binding proteins. The unsaturated fatty acids, don't get me wrong, if you're eating too much and you're getting an abundance of lots of fatty acids, saturated fatty acids can displace thyroid hormone from thyroid binding protein, as an example, particularly transthyretin. And the other component of that, before I get too sidetracked, is that unsaturated fatty acids have a much more potent binding effect to these thyroid binding proteins and can displace T4 much more easily than the saturated fats. But if you're eating too much, toxicity of this kind of high fat state, which we know that can make rodents diabetic pretty quickly when we get them to eat way too many calories, can have that effect as well. So starting on nutrition is the fundamental, and it might be looking at water intake. People will go down that route of flooding themselves with water, eating lots of kind of vegetables and nuts and seeds, which they just can't digest that well. So getting digestion functioning, looking at sleep. I think digestion is usually the first thing that tends to come back, and energy, and less dips, and feeling more balanced throughout the day, getting blood sugar responses worked on. And it just depends on the person where you go from there. It might be kind of ticking all those boxes off, because some people generally have all that element of stress going on, whether it's EMF, whether it's kind of pollutants and stuff. And it's where we see the progress that I kind of then send them more information to go over. But I try not to give them too much to start with, because it can be quite overwhelming. And, there's a short questionnaire with 250 questions on it, which gives you a rough idea of what's going on. And when you start to tinker with the other things, it just can take some time, to the extent that someone's been 10, 20 years of being stuck in the stress response. It can take a bit longer than you think sometimes.
That's a really good point. So you just blew my mind. Did you say like even saturated fats can displace transthyretin from thyroid binding protein? Because there's all these people that are like promoting like You don't need any supplements, just eat a lot of saturated fat, and that's like a good PUFA detox. But that doesn't, it just seems too like myopic to me. Like that, I mean, could help, but you could overdo it.
Yeah, no, the important point to take is if you're overeating saturated fat.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, saturated fat is generally more protective, but again,
Mm-hmm.
you can eat too much of it, just like you can eat too much sugar, just like you can eat too much anything, right? There's a balance. But I just think saturated fat in the right amount, in a moderate amount, and keeping some of the unsaturated fats to a minimum still is very, very relevant. And you can go and look at all these meta-analysis and look at compare relative risk to absolute risk reduction. And you're always going to come up with the fact that when you look at an algorithm of, say, heart protection, you're going to see lower LDL levels, you're going to see lower triglycerides, but that's not looking at the key components of what long-term perhaps destruction or let's say catabolism at, say, the cell membranes, the increased phospholipids that are more unsaturated fats, their ability to oxidize, flip-flop within this so-called membrane and cause problems. So I think saturated fats can do that, but if you're eating too much of them, that's where the issue is. But with unsaturated fats, they can do that a lot easier. So again, it's like anything with nutrient intake, it's trying to get that balance right.
Yeah, someone asked, why do you never eat chicken? That question made me laugh.
I eat chicken once a week. I think eating chicken on a bone, as my kids love chicken with chicken skin. So, I mean, apparently there is slightly more PUFA in there that, it's a bit like eating pork. Depending on what they're fed most of the time is some of the issue, of course. But I certainly don't shy away from eating chicken once a week.
It tastes great. Yeah, I won't turn down like chicken tacos.
I mean, I can't beat. We managed to get some reasonable organic food out here, despite the environment. It's usually shipped in from Europe, mind. But yeah, nothing wrong with chicken.
And before we started recording, you mentioned there's environmental progestins. I've never heard of that. So they're like progesterone mimickers, kind of.
So
progesterone.
Yeah, well, if you look at an abundance of the progestins, particularly when they first started being formulated back at the back end of the last century, so you saw them creeping into, say, hormone replacement therapy. You saw them being used as contraceptive pills, as an example. These are some of the progestins that have a more of an estrogen-like effect. I mean, they have a very similar chemical composition with the A frame of the molecule, but then everything else beyond that, there's nothing similar to it, to normal progesterone, and that's where it has its very negative effects. But again, still, I mean, you can read this in kind of Ray's work or John Lee's work, the suggestion that there's a muddying of the waters between synthetic progestins and natural progesterone still exists, and you can see that in lots of the literature if you choose to go and look at it. And so you get a double whammy of, say, the exogenous or the kind of external sources of estrogens from, say, beta-17 estradiol from your contraceptives combined with progestins or your progesterone mini pills. And they're kind of more of the things that you're going to see from an external source, which then interact with, say, the external sources of estrogen, and whether that's coming from pollutant skincare products like soy with diadazine and the other soy phytoestrogens. All of this can accumulate. I don't think even eating soy irregularly every now and then is going to be so bad if it's from a non-GMO source. But at the same time, it's like, what is the load that pushes someone over the edge? So it might be kind of eating, the soybeans. It might be eating some form of soy or a soy protein that could have this effect. And there's no doubt that long-term sustained phytoestrogen consumption does lead to a kind of estrogen-like state. You couple that with kind of consumption of perhaps a mini pill or a progestin pill and other things, and you might see that kind of, the ability to stimulate excess estrogen or all of the negative effects with it are easily achieved.
Wow. And using like a 20% progesterone cream, the pathway that takes is kind of dependent on a lot of factors, right? Like your overall, how you're living, whether it turns into cortisol or...
But, there's the pathways. When progesterone gets depleted, as an example, you'll tend to see people, particularly females as an example, tend to start producing more progesterone by the DHEA pathway, which will convert to androstenedione, and then, to the other androgens and like testosterone. And sometimes when there's a problem, aromatase into estrogens. So it's always good to keep the progesterone pathway topped up, I think. And that's where you'll start to see problems, particularly in females and, well, guys as an example. Females more facial hair, guys less hair on their head. Females seeing thinning hair on their head as well. So I think that there is method to maintaining optimal levels of progesterone. And bearing in mind as well, if we look at it from a relatively less molecular perspective, there's that aspect on function and how progesterone has these organizational qualities. Or we can look at, it's a hormone of differentiation, for an example, whereas estrogen is more of a building, proliferator of tissues. And we can talk about perhaps that in a second. But, progesterone will bind to the progesterone receptor as an example. And that can have different effects depending on whether you look at perhaps the receptor A or B, which will have differing effects in the reproductive tissues or the breasts. But, these progesterone receptors can be stimulated by the estrogen receptors, which can be stimulated by stress and, environmental pollutants that can have a negative effect. So I think there's actually quite a lot of mileage for a lot of females living in a stressful, polluted environment, often need extra progesterone as a protective measure. And, one of the not criticisms, I still get a lot of people who come from the same background as me. So I don't want to take medication or hormones because I don't want to mess around. I just want to stay natural. And this concept of natural is so hard these days. We can look at it, say, from your example of living off the grid. We want to be in an environment that's more conducive to physiology, and experiencing kind of optimal kind of magnetism or whatever it is, less EMF stress, whatever. But for the average person on the street, it's hard to be natural these days in any shape or form. Or you could argue philosophically that it is nature because it's just the product of nature of where you're at. Because everything man-made to a degree has some element of nature in it, right? It's being produced by nature because humans are nature. To the extent whether it's productive or not is another question entirely. So I think it's about just being able to become more robust in any given environment. And how we mentioned earlier, rather than seeing everything around you as being stressful, progesterone is one of those things that will organize tissues, organize how tissue responds, whether it's kind of optimizing blood sugar responses. And there's some contentious around that. Depends on how you look at hormones throughout pregnancy. But also, one of the many, you can find several papers where progesterone is touted as the ultimate endometrial and ovarian protector, or it's studies in traumatic brain injury for reorganizing, any number of neural pathways is very, very efficient. And I think estrogen probably has a small role to play in some of the synapses and growth on some occasions. And this is where perhaps estrogen, we not always need to see it as anything that's really bad. It's the potential for estrogen to be stimulated very, very easily, and that can occur. But going back to reorganizing brain and neural structures, the research on progesterone and traumatic brain injury is quite it's very productive.
That's a really good point about estrogen. It's not just evil across the board. Someone might misinterpret how I speak on the podcast, say we want to make it zero. Same as serotonin and prolactin, right? And all these things that have the potential for harm. Just keep them at 1% or keep them at a balanced level, and they're going to rise and fall depending on conditions, right? Pregnancy and
absolutely. It's the same thing about the stress response. It's very easy to stimulate nitric oxide, serotonin, prolactin, and estrogen tends to synergize with all of those responses. And that's why, I think keeping some of those low, and, if you look at some of the research on COVID that's come out as well, depends on how you look at it. But, the fact is that elevations of nitric oxide, inhibition of the aerobic metabolism, excess perhaps production of estrogen, and that's contentious in its own, because some people are saying estrogen therapy for dealing with COVID, when actually a lot of females seem to be far more susceptible to COVID, and that might give you perhaps an idea that there might be an estrogen excess, perhaps increased nitric oxide, less progesterone available. And there's several papers on why methylene blue maintaining thyroid function, and even some progesterone stuff that's come out that's suggestive that it's quite protective. Interestingly enough, I have a friend, an old client of mine. Her husband just got COVID, and he was in an ICU for a week, and she's been taking antihistamines, progesterone, and methylene blue, and didn't really have any symptoms at all. So he didn't take anything. So it was quite interesting to see that.
Yeah, I love your concept of natural point, because I think that kind of people are holding on to that natural kind of utopian view, and they're guzzling, green juice that's grown with, vegetables that are grown with tap water and bio sludge and synthetic fertilizers and, acid rain. And they're just stuck on this natural view, but they're aging faster.
Well, interesting enough, I posted something on Facebook today, just on my page, and it was about 2 cases of 2 infants that suffered from methylglobulinemia, which is basically nitrate poisoning from eating raw courgettes. They were constipated from formula-fed babies that were constipated, so they thought it was a good idea to give them some raw courgette stew juice stuff, and they developed this cyanosis, blue lips, and basically you get oxidized hemoglobin, which obviously when that occurs, you don't tend to oxygenate tissues very, very well. And a flip side to that, in another story from a couple of years ago, is in 2 cases of undercooked courgette stew that sped the demise of some pensioners, because it creates like a cyanide-like state, and therefore inhibits not just aerobic metabolism, the ability to utilize oxygen as an example. And interestingly enough, one of the primary interventions for treating this methylglobulinemia is actually methylene blue. So it restores oxygenation of tissues, decreases nitric oxide, decreases the this kind of stress response and intense vasodilation that occurs when the body's in an emergency state, trying to reoxygenate itself and get some opening up of different structures. So I found that quite interesting, and again it kind of falls back to that concept of just because it's green doesn't mean it's the best thing for you.
Right, the greenwashing. Yeah, I've seen some people in the alternative health space like recommend nitric oxide supplements, supplementing nitric oxide like directly.
Yeah,
and I'm like, this cannot end well, because I think Martin Paul was talking about how nitric oxide forms peroxynitrite from EMF exposure.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's just a synergizer, right, with so many things.
Yeah, the nitrosation, the peroxynitrate, all of these kind of lend themselves to kind of decreasing biological function. I think there's even quite a big trend in like cycling communities for beet juice, right? Increased nitric oxide. And I think it probably does have a very short-term beneficial effect. But when you keep trying to kind of get that production of energy when the energy is being degraded and the structures are being degraded, I mean, there are various different types of nitric oxide, right? And it's quite a novel gas and a neurotransmitter. And I think to the extent that you can keep throwing nitric oxide at a problem, perhaps we're using a case of COVID as an example, one of the things that you tend to see in these people in ICUs who are suffering is increased sepsis, vast amounts of nitric oxide being produced just as an emergency system. Lowering nitric oxide and lowering sepsis and endotoxin is one of the things that needs to be done. And that's why I think methylene blue has been shown to be very, very beneficial in a few studies. And so it doesn't make any sense why taking nitric oxide. And again, if you look at it in that kind of binary intervention that lots of people tend to look at things, oh, here we have a problem. Well, let's vaccinate against it because that makes sense. Or here, let's kind of open up the blood supply by nitric oxide. Well, that increases angiogenesis, and that's a hallmark of metastatic cancer, right? So, it's looking at the problems rather than being in this reductionist mechanism, which actually drives me sense. But don't get me wrong, I'm not an intelligent man and I don't understand mathematical complexity. But if you're not looking at a problem from a holistic thing and trying this binary intervention of one thing for a specific system without understanding all of the other things that are working as part of that problem, you're just opening up the biology for more artifacts and more problems, either in an acute or a chronic response.
That's true. Yeah, that's a good point. It's funny. Adam said that in our last interview, we were talking about beets, and he said they're a nitrogen accumulator, and he said that the nitric oxide mostly comes from non-organic beets, which I don't know why that would be the case. Maybe the fertilizer, because I know
Yeah,
NPK,
probably most likely. Yeah.
but it's probably safer to take beet juice powder or something like that than take directly nitric oxide, I'd imagine, because I know beets have like a biofilm dissolving effect and it has some benefits, but there's probably better options out there.
Yeah, I know
Nah.
you probably know more about the appropriate beet supplements than I do. For sure, it's not my kind of bag really, but yeah, it would make perfect sense. But certainly, increased fertilizers, nitrates, and other things in the soil would have an effect. And we know that kind of the less kind of organic stuff is, and the more perhaps GM stuff that you might see. I'm not sure. Can you get GM beets? Is that something they're growing? I'm not sure.
I don't think so. Possibly. I mean, it's been a while since I've looked at Costco beets or something.
Yeah,
But
well, equally, commercial farming tends to use more fertilizer, right? So
Mhm.
by default, you're probably bound to get more of that.
Yep. Yeah. Someone had a good question here. They said, "What is your most significant or shocking findings of your review with environmental pollutants?
Uh,
Has anything shocked you lately?"
I mean, the fact that, and it's like many medical interventions, and I keep getting some of my friends and family call me a conspiracy theorist for the stuff I've said, but it's like when you have understood and researched medical interventions and how little they go through rigorous safety testing, trial endpoints, and often have falsification of data and pulling of those trial endpoints because they're showing negative responses. There has probably been a vast amount of money used to not properly study or explore the role of all of these pollutants. Like if you just even take a look at you remember the film Dark Water, which is about the Teflon and DuPont and the class action brought against them for literally poisoning a whole town, right? That stuff is endemic. It's just across the globe, and whether it's VW who doctoring their emission certificates, or whether it's DuPont for not reporting the effects of Teflon and perfluoroalcohols, that they kind of all combine together. So the level of criminality is across the board to a degree because people are just concerned about making more money for stakeholders, and therefore all of those kind of spill into this big cocktail of deceit and also endocrine disruption, I think. So I'm not surprised anymore because when you see what large organizations have done to people in the name of science, call it science, but is really just about making more money, I don't think you get that surprised, and you can understand perhaps why the current strategies and stuff being shoved down people's throats is part of a bigger business plan more than anything else.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I remember. I think it was in high school or college. I did a project on Africa and the oil spills, and I think the Niger Delta, like Shell Oil, just had a huge
Yeah.
spill, and they, people fought them, and they couldn't, they were going against a beast, and so they couldn't win. And I was just looking into these oil spills, and there's one after another, and they just get away with it.
Yeah,
it's pretty crazy.
And it's not just that. I mean, if you only have to look at, say, Pfizer's rep sheet, I'm not sure if I should mention this on here and whether it's going to do anything to raise anything. But, I think they went into Uganda and basically went in and trialed this new drug, which killed, I can't remember if it killed a substantial amount of young people in the trial, and then just basically flew back out again. And if you could think something like that, I think it was out of something like, I can't remember exactly, I'll have to dig it out. It was about 100 people. I think 11 people died. So 10% of the trial group died. And a lot of people were left paralyzed. And literally it took years to go to court because they were suppressing everything, putting stuff into, as companies do, just keep it in the system and suppressing it. And I think they ended up having to pay 75 million compensation, which is nothing, absolutely nothing. And that's just, like I said, it's endemic. It's part of the problem. It could be oil. It could be, anything, pesticide use. I mean, look at in India as well. I think, wasn't it the Bhopal incident where you had a massive gas explosion, which I think was an American company again. I'm not sure. And basically you had hundreds of people dying of poison. I can't remember if it's hundreds or thousands, but it was a lot of people. And the artifacts of that, been seen up till now with kind of deformed births and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it reminds me of Chernobyl. There was like a made for TV kind of movie on that, and yeah, it's just complete negligence. Just like they knew it was happening. It's like, let's just let this experiment go and see what happens.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of that's part of the course with this that part of the world as well. And they tend to be able to get away a lot. I think it was part of the Soviet Union then, wasn't it? Still, I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
I remember being in the army in Germany, and I was part. We were having to look out for Russian marked cars all the time and things like that. Just going to show my age there. Just before the Berlin Wall came down. So.
Wow, you've been around. It's pretty cool. You have a very broad approach then, and imagine.
Well, I left the army, 28 years ago. So I only did 4 years, and I kind of realised after a very short time that I didn't like being told what to do, and so I did my time and got out, and I'm glad I did, to be honest.
I'm sure you learned some good stuff though. I bought like a British survival VHS tape. This house came with a VHS player, and it was from a military surplus store, and it was actually pretty wild. He was showing like 20 different ways to start a fire with like a flare and different
with a lighter, right? It was a good time. I learned a few things, got some basic things. I think I could still, do a few things, but I probably won't be called on to do it ever again, hopefully.
So we kind of briefly touched on EMFs because that's been a little bit of a passion of mine for the last decade, and I know there are some people that just focus in on 5G. Like I just interviewed Daniel DeBon of Defender Shield, and he makes like silver embedded like baseball caps and beanies and cell phone shields and stuff like that. And he was saying 5G is not that big of a deal. Like it's not too much different from 4G, but I think if we go above that, then it'll be a significant jump. But I think there's some people that just hyper focused in on that environmental pollutant, say like it's mainly EMFs, but I think it's another synergizer, right? It's just
and if you look at the historical research on 2G, 3G, 4G, there's very much, I'd say, beyond precautionary data, because you see structures. I mean, you can look at it from two perspectives. One is the heating and the irradiation of tissue, and they found that kind of heating ant rodents in particular, thyroid physiology, thyroid as an example, shows some very negative effects to the pathology of the thyroid. You see increased tissue changes to the cells, the colloid of the thyroid, and that can be very problematic. So if you're heating the thyroid up, that can be very problematic. And then you just have also the bursts, not just the heat, the bursts of the frequency itself. So it would make some sense why you wouldn't want to keep a phone in your pocket all the time when you have very, high energy consuming tissues like the testicles or the ovaries that are very prone to oxidative stress. So I think it's worth bearing in mind that those frequencies haven't gone away. So you will get an accumulation from 2G to 5G. 6G looks like it's coming as well. So that's another kind of factor. And again, it's what's going on. It's a bit like saying, why do people get skin cancer? And some people say, well, it's because of the sun. Well, no, it's not. It's because there's either an excess or a deficit of nutrients and other kind of skin sensitizing factors that lead to that. We should be able to tolerate long days in the sun with relatively no problem, or we take the fact that we kind of take a siesta from 12 to 2 to get out the big, the major heat rays when the sun's at its highest. But if you have too much estrogen, if you have too many unsaturated fatty acids in the skin, if you have a deficiency of vitamin A, this can lend itself to disorganization of some of the skin structures. So, for example, when you come to look at that from an EMF perspective, and you have these multiple frequencies and you have tissue, it's a perfect, structure for disorganization. And it's a bit like why oncologists talk about the seed and soil hypothesis from cancer. Is like you'll have a structure and then metastases take place, and they go to structures where they're probably at their most disorganized. So if somebody's got like a gut cancer and it's shown up in the bone as an example, or whatever in that relationship, you're probably going to areas where there's a very high amount of disorganization that kind of cancer cells can take root in. And it's the same thing with EMF. It's an accumulation of various pollutants and stressors that disorganize tissue and make people more prone to, you could say cancer is probably the ultimate form of disorganization, right? But it could be heart disease, it could be diabetes, it could be other metabolic diseases to boot. So it's just understanding why these kind of issues are kind of causing harm, and the more susceptible you are, the more likely you are to have a problem with it. So you could argue, extra planetary sources of radiation can combine with that, sunbursts and anything like that can have an effect. And even magnetic fields have been shown to have an effect as well. So, it can be, either beneficial magnetic fields or very kind of problematic magnetic fields that all lend themselves to increasing stress.
Yeah, I like the phrasing of disorganizing tissue, because it's a simplistic but also very accurate way of describing all of these things that we're dealing with. And I focused a lot on iron overload, like interviewing Morley Robbins and just looking at lipofuscin and how iron will complex with aluminum and PUFAs and estrogen. Yep. And that's like a major disorganizing factor of tissue. And I think that makes people more of an antenna for EMFs too.
Yeah, and I think if you heard of Christopher Exley.
Mm-mm.
So Professor Christopher Exley, he's from Keele University. He's had lots of crap recently because he's kind of supported some of the kind of like children's health defense stuff about aluminium accumulation. And he has over 30 years of aluminium research. And one of his primary kind of hypothesis is that accumulation of aluminium in the neural structures lend to the increase of beta amyloid, particularly the folded proteins that are, again, very disorganized and kind of a pathological trait that leads to dementia and perhaps Parkinson's and all of the other dysregulation that you see in the central nervous system. And he was saying that basically when you're looking at, say, a vaccination strategy in infants, if there's any aluminium sulfates or salts in there, they will accumulate and they will go to very sensitive structures that can cause problems. And he's not saying his research is insignificant. He's produced hundreds of papers. And if you can't come away from that thinking that aluminium is a problem, then again, synergize that with iron, synergize that with metals like cadmium, which is another potent thyroid disruptor, mercury from amalgams and other sources in our food stuff. And I think he was saying even in baby foods, as an example, that there were plenty of aluminium found in baby formula. I don't know how the hell that gets in there, but it does.
Wow. And I think at a fundamental level, a lot of these heavy metals just dispel electrons from the mitochondria, like from the cell. There's literally rob energy directly like a vampire.
Yeah, if you kind of combine that with estrogen, you get a double whammy of excitability. So you kind of get calcium flooding into the cell, you get, accumulation of water, you get inability of, say, the complex structures like the aerobic system and the electron transport chain to function. And then you get, disorganized other structures, whether it's the vascular system, it could be in the skin. And, you use lipofuscin as a prime example there of iron overload. I mean, it's like, and some of that you just can't see. Iron you see because you see oxidized iron in the skin. It kind of comes out as a brown spot, but you probably don't see that with other metals like aluminium and stuff. But until you look at them with some very fine, microscopic identification tools in the neural structures, it's hard to see it.
Yeah, I've heard some people say that graying of hair is just simplistically a copper deficiency, largely. Because the graying of hair is caused by the hydrogen peroxide of the iron overload. You have the Fent reaction.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you can. Some people talk about like assessing copper, And
Mm.
sometimes I don't really go down the route of that because, like, for example, you can be hypothyroid and that will deplete ceruloplasmin. So your copper levels will be low anyway. So I think you can. I think if you get someone on a diet that's got an abundance of liver in it, or even you do your 1 to 2 helpings per week and some organ meats or something, I think it's very hard to be copper deficient. And I think still thyroid, as an example, would be a prime driver why you see ceruloplasmin being low. So, but you can go down there's a number of things that you can look at. But to get back to your question, yeah, I've seen substantial kind of hairs change with adequate copper in the diet, and to the extent that there's an excess of copper, which can be achieved as well, that can cause just as many problems as well. Whether it's say from a copper IUD as an example, copper in the water, certainly copper again could be found in certain soils and waters. So yeah, it swings and roundabouts, isn't it? It could be either increase or decrease of the metal or whatever compound.
Yeah, yeah. Up here in Idaho, most people are on a well, at least in the rural areas. And it's funny because I took the whole house filter out of the old house and brought it here. And I went down there and turned the spigot on, and it was brown coming out of
Right.
the of the faucet, and that brown is irons, and people are just drinking that straight.
Yeah.
Especially in rural areas. And it's kind of wild that even when you're outside of the city, there are still like quote unquote natural environmental pollutants that you have to look out for.
Oh yeah, I mean it's hard to get around from. To be honest, I mean I live in an area where most of the water is desalinated from the sea, and thankfully I know the owner of a coffee roastery that has a big organic coffee roastery, and he put like I think it was would have been about $400,000-500,000 reverse osmosis machine with the filters that he changes every week, and they come out really brown, which is a combination of sand and other metals, I would imagine. And he remineralizes. It's got a tap on the side of the roastery, so you can I go up there with some big PET-free, PCB-free bottles and fill up a few of those a week for doing all my cooking and stuff in. So I think there is some mileage for getting clean water, and I think you can't discount the effects. Even if you live rurally, runoff from crops could be a problem. It could be glyphosates, right? It could be metals. It could be nitrates. All of that can have an effect. And like we said, it can be a minefield, but try not to get too overwhelmed for it. Do all the things that you can do, and you'll find that you can perceive the problems with a slightly more balanced approach rather than doing what I was doing 15 years ago. I was going, oh my God, I'm eating that so bad. And I was a real pain in the ass. Oh my God, I'm eating sugar. Oh my God, you shouldn't eat sugar, it causes cancer, and all the things like that. So yeah, I think it's just like, when you become slightly more organized from a structural and energetic perspective, you can perceive the problems and deal with them more efficiently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I like to just mitigate when I can, and take some vitamin E if I'm eating PUFAs out,
Yeah.
and just don't sweat it, or take some vitamin E and aspirin for the synergistic effect.
Yeah, all of those things: the vitamin E, aspirin, C, thyroid, progesterone. Methylene blue is one of my favorites for working with people at the moment because I've seen some really, really cool results with it.
Mm. That's awesome. Yeah, I've been using the lozenges, but I have some drops that I think the guy in the UK sent me, or Canada. Yeah, the guy in Canada,
Oh, yeah.
Adam.
Lifeblood, yes, he's a very.
Yep. Yeah.
He's very kindly donated some money to my PhD fund, which was very kind of him.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, someone asked about thiamine supplementation, and I'm curious your thoughts on that. That's B1, right?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, it's not a big area. I do recommend B vitamins. I think thiamine's to do with decarboxylation, right? And I think there can be a reason why B vitamins are often suppressed or deficient. As an example, estrogen can have a very significant effect on decreasing thiamine, riboflavin, and I think a couple of the other B vitamins as well. So it makes sense from an estrogen detox perspective. I use the word detox loosely. Probably should be using more metabolism. That it can help to perhaps deal with estrogen more efficiently. So I think there are probably, I haven't really looked at it, but I'm sure that many pollutants would have an effect on degrading liver function and therefore vitamin B needs, particularly thiamine as being an example of that. So I think it can be warranted to take a decent B complex sometimes. You can go for individual vitamins if necessary, and even test for that from like an organic acids test if you're really that way inclined. I generally think that you can cover most bases with a B complex, particularly if there are some kind of issues of fatigue that kind of come and go, even if you're looking at, say, thyroids being maintained very well. I think that there can be certainly an argument for it, yeah.
That's awesome. What are your top supplements or herbs for boosting dopamine and norepinephrine?
Thyroid. I think dopamine is an interesting one, but generally dopamine structures are well maintained. And one of the arguments in Parkinson's and the dopamine structures, say that the substantia nigra, and why people have issues with Parkinson's is a lack of thyroid, and therefore the dopamine receptors are optimally maintained when there's adequate thyroid. Norepinephrine or adrenaline, I think it's just probably part of maintaining the adrenals as well as you can. And I think to do that, to the extent that the thyroid is maintained efficiently, energy is kept efficiently, you're not stimulating that kind of serotonin, noradrenaline, adrenaline pathway a lot of the time, to the extent that you can kind of stay less stressed and less running off the adrenal hormones. I think that's probably the most efficient way. But I don't have a specific supplement. I think methylene blue has also been touted for dopamine structures again. I don't think you want to increase dopamine too much because it is an arousal neurotransmitter, and just like serotonin, it's also implicated in bringing you out of the REM phase of deep sleep. So I think I wouldn't go down the route of perhaps the Charles Poliquin route. It was always nuts and meat diet for raising dopamine, because I think that could be problematic.
Yeah, I used to promote, at least I made a YouTube video about it years ago when I was really into sun gazing and stuff, taking L-tyrosine and then exposing your naked eyes to the sun. And Jayton on my podcast was saying Mucuna, contains the L-dopa that can become dopamine. But yeah, that's a good point about getting too much. I think just like limiting artificial light can help, and social media, right, which tends to burn out our dopamine.
All of the things. I think I sometimes still think that most people do it. You sometimes have to pull yourself back because you think that some of the basic stuff, like switching off the lights and not watching too much TV after, say, 8 o'clock, and maybe reading a book instead, and getting off your social media stuff. Still a bunch of people that sleep with their phone by the side of their head at night. I've just been working with a girl, although part of it was nutritional. Literally, huge clump of hair had fell out, and it was on the side where her mobile phone was. And I posted on Instagram the results that we got in the space of a couple of months of just working on nutrition and how to get the phone out of the bloody bedroom. But all of these things can have an effect on how dopamine kind of synergizes with its receptors and production. But just like all the other kind of neurotransmitters and hormones being dysregulated from excess stimulus and too much excitability.
Mm-hmm. That's a good segue. Someone asked, "What's the ideal nighttime routine for optimal and regenerative sleep?" Just take some Cipro. No, just kidding.
Yeah, why not? I think it depends on the person, right? Because somebody might need some Cipro for that. And I always, as I said about, and I'm just digressing slightly about long-term use, I do know people that have taken Cipro for a couple of years with no ill effects and done absolutely fine. But I think using that can be very, very useful for inhibition and getting that deeper sleep. But I do think, shutting off social media, I'm not watching too much TV. I mean, I'm guilty of watching a film every now and then at night, but it might be once or twice a week. But I think if you can kind of calm the system down by switching off electrical stuff and reading a book is always great. Some people, I do some breathing exercises sometimes. I lay in front of red light. These are the things I'm recommending to clients. I'm eating a snack if I feel that I'm hungry so I can get into sleep. Some people don't need to eat. So it's really an it depends thing. Some people might do really well with a glass of milk and some gelatin, salt and honey. That's a really great way of getting into sleep. Some people can just go to sleep just like that with a cup of coffee still. And I think that's just a sign of a pretty good function. And, caffeine can calm the nervous system down if your system is working not too badly. It can have adverse effects when you don't have enough energy to support that function. But I think it really just depends. But obviously, an absence of blue light, not too much stimulus, using some red light, having some food, I think, are the basics that most people can stick to. Avoid any stimulus, kind of excess stimulus from smells and stuff like that. Sometimes that can keep people awake. If it's some noxious smells, cleaning products, that's always good to avoid doing stuff like that then. But I think just getting the basics of light modulation, perhaps EMF modulation, certainly having the energy to get you into sleep. That's one of the primary reasons why people don't sleep or they wake up. So I think all of those basic things. And again, you get things like GABA. You could use more potent things like an antihistamine if you were trying to get your sleep back, but again, not for long-term use perhaps. So I think it really just depends. Even some people do quite well with a little bit of thyroid before bed as well.
Yeah, I've experimented with that. Definitely felt like I slept better. Yeah, someone actually asked that question, how to figure out optimal thyroid dosage. And you might have mentioned this in our first chat, but it's basically like keep the dosage the same for 2 weeks. Is that right? Like don't change it.
Yeah, I sometimes boil that down to like 10 days. And sometimes I think some people can notice the effects of thyroid almost instantly. I've had some people go, I just know that I'm kind of back to myself straight away. Within the first day, I think, you need to wait that kind of pull before you increase. So I think it's prudent to wait 10 days to 14 days just to see what's happened. And you often find many people need to go up a dose if they've been on a very low dose. And I always start with something like half a grain for most people, just from a prudent safety perspective. Not that, I think as I said, generally you're not going to have any problems when you start with a low dose. But you've usually got a good idea of someone's function anyway, but you titrate up that and bring that up over time.
Mm-hmm. How much do you take?
Me? I actually take one Cyanoplus a day, which is about 2.5 grains.
Okay. Yeah, I've been experimenting with upping it, and I haven't found an upper limit yet, but maybe I will. I mean, you could tell if your heart rate goes too high, right? Or
you should do. And the typical sign of getting too much thyroid hormone is tachycardia, well above 90 beats a minute. Some people actually do well at that 85 to 90 as well, interestingly enough. And usually you might find that the the temperature goes up. Sometimes you can find very interesting effects. And I think this is related to stress, mold, fires and pollution. So I've seen somebody who's systemically quite low with temperature, but their heart rate's kind of hyper. And I think that's also to do with the fuel and the way that the heart's become relatively inflexible. And you'll see like a heart rate well above 100, but the body temperature is still like 35.5 degrees. So it can be different tissues that are kind of slightly hyper and some are hypo, but there are ways around that. Things like methylene blue can help out with kind of improving how the heart uses glucose as opposed to breaking down fatty acids as a fuel all the time. And I think that's where you tend to see this negative effect. So it's an interesting one to play around with. I've even seen someone recently with thyroid hormone resistance who took 90 grains within a week and had no effects at all.
Wow. Why would that be, do you think?
I think it's that there's some level of resistance, something from a pollutant perspective, something that they probably require excess amounts of T3. I mean, one of the medical treatments for thyroid hormone resistance is to whack up the T3, but to diminish the effects of the heart rate is to take beta blockers or something to bring the heart rate down. And so that's something that some people have considered. I think that can be... I think that if you're dealing with something like that, you need to probably speak to someone about doing that because there are risks. But there's, I've had some clients who've just gone out. In fact, is more of a friend and somebody had a consultation, and I said, this is up to you to go and experiment with. And I was quite surprised because I took a whole bottle of NDT within a week, which is 90 grains. I said had no effect at all, didn't do anything to me. And so I think there's individual cases for perhaps looking at some of the thyroid cofactors, selenium, perhaps iodine, but unlikely to be iodine, It can be. There's no reason why it can't be in some cases. But zinc and all of the other cofactors, even magnesium, in some weird cases, even iron in some. But I think they're few and far between.
And vitamin A too, right? Because does thyroid vitamin A work to make the hormones, or partly?
Yeah, it will help with conversion of thyroid hormones, but also have a synergistic effect with the other hormones as well. So if you don't have enough progesterone because you're vitamin A deficient, and you also with the carrier proteins and the red blood cell count like hemoglobin and all the other values which can also appear as like an anemic state, but in reality they could be a vitamin A or thyroid deficiency for sure.
Wow, I think that was me for years. I've told the story before, but I was diagnosed with anemia just by like a TCM practitioner, like 3 times in the course of like 5 years. And I was, vegan, vegetarian. So I was definitely thyroid and vitamin A deficient that whole time.
Yeah. And like there's many ways to for somebody to say, oh yeah, you're iron deficient, especially if we're just looking at serum iron or even a transferrin value. You need to look at the other markers. You need to understand thyroid. You need to understand vitamin A values for sure, and even how much sunshine you're getting. I mean, I get very horrible cracked feet if I live in the desert, so. If I've been out in the desert, I know I'm vitamin A deficient because I'll get very cracked feet, which when I apply 50,000 IUs of vitamin A just disappear within a week. So, there are, again, like many other constraints and factors that you need to consider. And it becomes, you can understand why a lot of people who perhaps look at some of these things and they go, I'm not getting the results, or perhaps they're trying too many things at once. And, the interventions become difficult to know what's working and what's not working. And that's why it's always prudent to start with a few and see how you get on. And sometimes when you're low thyroid, you can be kind of, jumping on the magnesium and zinc all the time and feeling better, but never really getting to what you actually need. But don't get me wrong, they're still useful supplements, but there can be a substantially less need when you have adequate thyroid function for many nutrients to a degree.
Because they're retained more. That's a really good point.
Yeah. Sodium, magnesium. You can also, your digestive system works, which means you can absorb nutrients more efficiently. And many other factors to boot.
I wonder because like Martin Paul and others talk about the calcium ion channels opening with EMFs, and like how calcium channel blockers are like an EMF mitigation, but magnesium is a natural calcium channel blocker. So I wonder if there's context too of like someone living in Los Angeles or somewhere, New York City in a high-rise apartment where their magnesium needs, even if everything's ideal, still has to be, maybe 4, 5, 6 grams a day or more, just because that EMF constant exposure with the calcium channel opening and even ion flooding.
Well, I think there's many things to kind of get from that, and it's probably another topic in itself when you kind of look at, perhaps how the membranes work and how the channels work. And, I've seen some interesting things about magnesium providing an adequate cell entry of calcium. And when you don't have enough magnesium, essentially the calcium can flow into the cell because there's not enough organization provided the magnesium. And it's whether you look at perhaps the membranes from this kind of membrane pump channel fit point, or whether there's kind of, the coacervates and the proteins providing the structure and reactions with the water, the hydrophilic or hydrophobic reactions and many other things. But equally, the end point is kind of disturbances at this kind of this area that's supposed to provide integrity and structure. And when you get aspects of EMF, it will create some level of disorganization. It will perhaps make the unsaturated phospholipids, like the kind of more longer chain stuff, cause more problems, more leakier membranes, calcium floods into the cell, and other factors like that. Interestingly enough, I think it's been shown, and I think this goes back to Pollutt's work, that you don't necessarily need sodium or potassium to be part of what's going on there, but calcium does seem to be a key part of that. So you could remove sodium from the cell and potassium from the cell, but you'd still get action potential. But if there was calcium that was reduced from there, then you wouldn't get the full action potential that would be occurring as a part of that kind of electronic interface with the so-called membrane, or however you choose to look at it from the organized proteins.
Interesting. Wow. What are your best practices for restoring liver health? Someone asks. So the
Well,
liver gets hit with these pollutants, right? Pretty hard.
yeah, I think, aspirin, niacinamide can be useful. I think thyroid is one of the biggest things that you can do to restore liver health because, aspects like non-alcoholic fatty liver disease have a very considerable overlap with low thyroid. When your thyroid is low, you accumulate more fatty acids within the liver. You're certainly more prone to absorbing lots of the unsaturated fatty acids. You're certainly more prone to not being able to regulate energy. You'll get alterations to the liver enzymes like AST, and GGT, and they can go either way, depending on what's going on. So I think just keeping the liver ticking over with energy, not it sounds pretty silly, but not overeating or undereating, getting the right amount of nutrients, certainly getting some of the more protective nutrients that can help, like vitamin C, polyphenol rich. Caffeine is a wonderful nutrient for restoring liver health, and it's shown to be very, very protective against liver carcinomas. So getting caffeine in, again, not getting too much and making sure that you can utilize it without stimulating the stress response. I think vitamin E can have some certainly beneficial effects on liver health. I think getting adequate vitamin A can be useful for the liver as well, obviously. And a bunch of the general nutrients, I think just keeping, as long as you can regulate glucose responsiveness reasonably well by having good thyroid, not eating too much fat, as an example, and other factors, you can generally regulate the liver, but it's built on the better function of thyroid, like every other organ, to be honest. Some people use some of the more, common stuff like milk thistle and, other supplements. And to be honest, I've never really looked at the efficacy of any of those, to be honest.
Yeah, for years I did like coffee enemas, and which I think decreases iron with that gallbladder kind of flushing effect.
Yeah.
Will take some iron with it, which is probably its biggest benefit. And I used to take milk thistle and liver herbs, but I didn't notice a huge difference in my overall health until I started integrating the stuff that you just mentioned.
Yeah,
and it was like night and day.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think obviously one of the basic things is something like carrot salad, bamboo shoots, mushrooms, even grated coconut as an example. Primarily just because when you get someone to go to toilet on a regular basis multiple times a day, you decrease the potential for kind of metabolites of estrogens and other byproducts to be reabsorbed into the bloodstream, to go back up to the liver, to be further detoxified again instead of being excreted. So, keeping the bowel moving, keeping the bacteria at a manageable level, keeping endotoxin low can have a much beneficial effect on the liver that you perhaps people don't often think about as part of that. But if you're going to toilet every day, it has a substantial beneficial effect on the liver.
Yeah, that's a good point. Have you ever used vitamin K2 with clients, like the MK4 or MK7?
Do you know what? I haven't, and it's just one of those things that I've never got around to. I have with the odd person here and there, and I think when I've kind of been, I think the odd person with bone health, I've been more concerned about. I've kind of considered that, and I think, sorry, that's more, a combination of Ks, but the K2 for like ubiquinone stuff and optimizing electron transport, I haven't really, to be honest. No, it's not something I've looked at with any depth. Some people have reported using it, and I think it's one of those things you're probably not going to notice really dramatic effects with it, but it might enhance energy production to a degree. But then you could argue, perhaps even using something like methylene blue, which would donate and accept electrons throughout the electron transport chain, would be beneficial as well. Some people talk about, N-acetylcysteine as another one, and all of the other things that I tend not to use those, to be honest, because I've never really found a need to. But some people have experimented and reported some really good results. But, I don't know every supplement that's out there, and I don't know every intervention. It's kind of the things that that you work with, and I've been experimenting with some clients more with taurine, and I found that has some really good effects. And it's kind of like you have your toolbox, and you just add something every now and then that you perceive some benefit to. And I might kind of look at that further down the line at some point, but I don't have any time. I don't have any time at the moment. It's just like study, work, family, sleep. That's it.
No, I get it. Yeah, no, you have a lot of cool tools in your box. I was in Southern California for 30 years, and I think there's like a huge like vegan, vegetarian kind of trend down there, and I got swept up in that. And just firsthand, I noticed like people's dentition falling apart, like their teeth rotting out and stuff from that nutrient deficiency, and probably a combination of toxicity. And I remember this one woman, I was going to rent like a room from her little shed in the back years ago, and she was breaking down from like osteoporosis, and she was vegan. And back then I didn't know, because I was like fruitarian. I was like, just eat more fruit or something. But looking back now, I'm like, she's probably K2 deficient, and amino acid deficient, and retinol, especially, all those. So
I mean, I do think kind of get people to eat a lot of cheese to cover that base to a degree. So I'm recommending, kind of various aspects of kind of cheeses, that will have some of those nutrients in. And, that's just a foundation part of understanding that people can eat dairy, some of the protective nutrients that you get in it. And, some of why sometimes I don't go down the specific route of adding some of those supplements in, because you can get a certain amount from food. And, as most people tend to be really scared of dairy until they find out that it's their stress digestive system that's driving the problem.
Yeah, we had pasta last night, and I tried to use a whole block of hard cheese whenever I had pasta to make it count.
Oh, why not?
Someone asked your
big cheese.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. No.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. What are your thoughts on progesterone dosage? Like how to figure that out?
I kind of go down the route of really just I have a very general approach with some kind of more hands-off clients that I kind of follow, that you'll see on the instructions you get with progesterone. I think just some clients I've seen go up to very high doses because the symptoms haven't resolved unless they've gone up high doses, and it's usually applying a few drops, like up to three drops, which is about anywhere between 9 to 15 milligrams within the end of the day, within the dosing strategy. And I think going up to you can go up to 10 times that amount, and I've seen certainly people need that before. I generally find there's a sweet spot between 3 and 7 drops throughout the day. I'm still not convinced that generally that there's going to be this conversion to estrogen all the time. So some people can do quite well on a low dose. Some people need a much higher dose, and it's really a suck it and see. And some people just can't differentiate about what's actually, whether it's being positive or not. And sometimes those people perhaps don't need it. But you can get a good idea from some of the supplements, PMS, insomnia, probably rampant tissue growth, whether it's fibroids, polyps, endometriosis, sore breasts, all these kind of things. And I've seen guys use it really, really well with some stuff and low doses as well. And I generally keep them to a couple of drops here and there throughout the day if needed for a very short-term dose. But it's really a suck-it-and-see approach, and seeing and really kind of correlating it with the symptoms. And, sometimes there's even a need to go throughout the menstrual cycle with it, depending on how aggressive someone's symptoms are, how much estrogen they produce. But generally, as a rule of thumb, the days 14 to 26 is usually fine. But there can be cases for beyond that.
Do you look at these things like thyroid, aspirin, progesterone as like antihistamines, even they could be cycle breakers? Because a lot of people think you're just going to become dependent on these things forever. But my experience has been like going into stressful times, just upping my dose or just getting that buffer kind of breaks me out of. It just strengthens my system. And
absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree with you. I mean, I've seen people come off thyroid meds. I've seen people go on thyroid meds. I've seen people take more progesterone, take methylene blue, stop them. There could be a time and a place for adding something adaptive that's going to make you more aware of the problem. I mean, being aware of the problem is just a great place to be, that you can experiment with something and work out what's going on. So whether it's, Baron and aspirin has been shown for a very long time to be very protective. And I think the novel kind of ideas that Gerald Pollock's saying, that it helps to improve, structured water, a full phase water, that's really interesting. So all of these things, and there can be literally many things. It could be like perhaps, progesterone, thyroid, amantadine. It could be methylene blue. It could be salt. It could be sugar. It could be vitamin C. It could be something that's just missing from someone's profile in that particular time. Whatever kind of catabolic pathway stress takes, that's why some people can do really well from someone taking more orange juice. And I saw a doctor the other day, I think he's a bit of a narcissist, calling out someone saying, "Oh, this adrenal cocktail is a load of bullshit." And it's like, well, do you actually know how the adrenals work? Do you know what the adrenals store? How do adrenals produce their hormones? What's one of the vitamins that they burn through when you're going through increased amounts of stress? Well, it's vitamin C. So that's why drinking orange juice and giving someone some salt with it to lower the adrenaline response, give them enough energy and all of the other protective polyphenols might just be the thing that they need. So you're rubbishing it, but you don't really know what you're talking about. And that's the problem. A lot of doctors comment on stuff that they don't really understand because the way that they've been taught is just in this very algorithmic, methodical manner that doesn't really explore learning experiences sometimes. I would happily debate them anytime on some of the stuff they're talking about. And given that I studied with doctors, and don't get me wrong, there are some great doctors out there who do wonderful things, but they just don't think about nutrition and some of the aspects of perhaps becoming more robust within your environment by getting adequate nutrition. There are still some endocrinologists that think that your nutrition doesn't affect your hormones, which is crazy to entertain if you have any basic understanding of physiology.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Kind of off topic, but yesterday we were hiking and my lady got stung by a wasp.
Yeah.
And I had some aspirin on me. So I actually found a rock and crushed it up and then poured some of my water on and just made a little paste on the go. And it seemed to help a little bit, but it's funny. I looked it up and there's like this attack, against it, did like a randomized control trial of topical aspirin for bee and wasp stings and basically found that it didn't do anything. But I was just wondering, since you're kind of out there, if you've experimented with bites or rashes or with aspirin, because it seemed to help, but
well, to be honest, my kids get bitten by mosquitoes quite a bit, and I apply vitamin E, and it seems to work wonders.
Cool.
I've used aspirin. My son, he's fair-headed. He's more of a kind of like strawberry blonde ginger hair, and he'll get sunburn every now and then when we spent too long out in the sun. And I've often used my own sunblock that I make with a bit of progesterone, vitamin E, shea butter, and coconut oil. And sometimes I put aspirin into that as well. And he's come back where he hasn't, when you get really burnt, you peel his skin. It's been really red. And then within a few days, it's actually gone down very, very quickly. I think probably with aspirin, because technically to a degree, you are inhibiting perhaps part of the immune pathway that would be dealing with a bite or something. So there may be some perhaps suggestion that sometimes in some cases, depending on the bite and the poison that's been put into the tissue, that may have a negative effect. But I think if you're thinking about it from a longer term perspective after that, it might be more beneficial. But I think it can certainly help for many things. And there have been many reasons why aspirin's been rubbish multiple times from a corporate perspective, because it's not worth any money to people, but it can do some really good things.
Yeah, I remember during this. Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry, a bit like progesterone.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think aspirin helps with COVID, right? There were a lot of articles. Israel was experimenting with it.
Well, I think they need to, because they've done so much damage with their strategy, probably. But yeah, I think aspirin can be very, very useful from a metabolic standpoint, inhibiting lipolysis, promoting more oxidation of carbohydrates. And bear in mind, that's the hallmark of metabolic inflexibility, right? When you can't utilize carbs efficiently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's funny because I have a lot of really smart people on the show, and they're very anti-sugar a lot of the time, and so it's tricky with the whole insulin and insulin resistance thing, and we've just been so misled over the years, and it's been almost like, I was thinking about it the other day, almost like a game of telephone. I feel like, where you don't know, even with the Linus Pauling thing and high dose vitamin C. Did he use ascorbic acid? There's even a question with that.
Yeah, sure.
Or was he using other stuff or amino acids in combination? So it's hard to know.
I think it kind of ties into a lot of the arguments you see within the health sphere. One is sugar, and it's like, well, if you don't really understand what's going wrong from a thyroid pancreatic signaling perspective, You see so many diabetics that go, "Oh, I can't have sugar." And it's like, well, actually, if you improve the glucose signaling, and that's where people make the mistakes, they cut out sugar, and of course the blood glucose response is going to look better. Of course, perhaps the insulin might look better after time, but there's a flip side to that, because you can send it the other way, where you can make insulin signaling even worse, and that's why some people who fasted, gone on low calorie or low carb diets, actually can have worse glucose responsiveness. And so that can be, if you're not looking at that point, you make this binary kind of inference that sugar is the problem. But we know there are many other things that can cause a problem. But it's the constant breakdown of fatty acids and gluconeogenesis in the diabetic state that causes the problems. And that's not usually a sugar issue. It's a pollutant issue. It's a fatty acid issue sometimes. It's signaling. It's a lack of thyroid. It's a lack of function of the beta cells. It's all of these things that lead to that state. And, I think the other thing is like vitamin A. And there's quite a few anti-vitamin A proponents in the States. And I think, again, if potentially in the US, you can consider that there's a vast amount of the population that are low thyroid that are just not detected by blood tests. They're exposed to a vast amount of pollutants and other stressors that can degrade that function. And what we talked about at the beginning, the inability of the hypothalamus and the pituitary to respond to low thyroid levels systemically, is that's when you can see problems. And then you start to see vitamin A and its analogs accumulate. You start to see the carotenoids accumulate. You see the orange fat pads in the hands and the feet. You see that. And it's like, well, yes, you're going to see that accumulate. And yes, when you start eating more of these foods or even take the supplements, if the liver can't function efficiently and you're in a low thyroid state, you're going to see vitamin A excess. And you will see vitamin A toxicity because you can't utilize it efficiently. So then again, are you blaming the messenger, or are you kind of ignorant of the hierarchies above it? And I think if you don't look at the potential up and downstream stuff, then that's where you run into problems. And I think that kind of draws into Dennis Noble. I quote him again about kind of downward and upward levels of causation. It's like if we kind of look at it from a gene-centric point of view, you don't really get anywhere because genes don't do anything. They're a template. They're kind of there for they're not even a template. They're kind of there to draw upon. But then you can get altered physiology, altered metabolism. You get organ dysfunction, which will drive gene transcription. It's like the gene theory of an upward level of causation doesn't have any basis, because you need all the other working machinery for it to function. And you have all these other aspects of hierarchy above that drive gene transcription. And, even talking about the kind of very pertinent issue where everyone's saying about, RNA driving gene transcription, the dogmatic belief that DNA just flows to RNA and protein, when it's very easy to get the other effect with reverse transcriptases. So it's kind of crazy.
Wow. Yeah, those are great points. And I'm glad you brought up the beta cells too. I'll link an article that I found in the show notes. It's from 2016 by the Clinical Pediatric Endocrinology Journal, Environmental Contaminants in Pancreatic Beta Cells. And it basically goes through all the pollutants that harm the beta cells, but the metals that we were talking about, like cadmium, says it's a metalloestrogen that has a half-life of 30 years that accumulates in the beta cells of the pancreas and reduces insulin secretion. Arsenic is also a stressor of the pancreatic cells, and mercury causes glucose intolerance. So it's like just those three alone.
and they're all classic thyroid disrupting metals as well. And when you I think one of the reasons when a lot of parents perhaps whose children develop type 1 diabetes aren't aware that perhaps the acquired inheritance that they've passed on, which is a product of the environmental stressors, will cause the pancreas to not develop efficiently. There'll be lack of optimal morphogenesis in the features, whether it's appropriate size beta cells, and all comes along as a sudden stressor. It could be increased pollutant, could be a viral. People talk about autoimmune diabetes, and it's literally it's a stressor that's caused the pancreas to become dysfunctional. We know that when there are high levels of stress, thyroid hormone is suppressed. We know we'll get a lot of those kind of other markers, whether it's high cortisol, prolactin, serotonin. ultimately the glucocorticoids and cortisol that will suppress thyroid physiology and optimal conversion of T4 to T3. So it shouldn't make you have too many problems with the fact that the pancreas is just less well formed, less functionally sound, less structurally sound, and therefore prone to damage. And I still am under the belief that if you can catch this so-called type 1 diabetes in time, it's reversible. And certainly rodents, which are obviously very different to humans, but at the same time, they've managed to make rats diabetic and reverse it with thyroid hormone.
Wow, that's awesome. Well, this was a lot of fun, Keith. Thanks so much for coming back. We'll have to make this a regular thing because I always have so much fun talking with you, and I make so much notes. And I'll have to look at Christopher Exley. I jotted his name down, and yeah.
I think he'd be a really good person to chat to. Actually, he's got a lot of stuff to say, and I certainly a credible researcher. But yeah, I'm surprised I managed to do so well since I've been up so long. I'm actually off to bed in a minute.
That's amazing that you can go. Your brain could go like that right before bed. That's impressive. That's a testament to how you're living. So. Yeah, so is your website Balanced Body Mind? Is that?
That's it, yeah. Balancedbodymind.com, on Instagram as Tomo Littlewood. And that's it, yeah. And anybody's interested, I do have a PhD fund for independent science. If anybody's interested, so feel free to ever donate. You don't have to, of course. I'm always available for coaching and seminars for practitioners as well. So, but thank you very much.
That's awesome. Thanks, Keith. Stick around as I close out the show.
Good to see you, Matt.
Well, that's all for today's show. I hope you took notes. I was fascinated by the T4 to T3 enzyme conversion being restricted and blocked by pollutants. It seems like these environmental pollutants work on every level to shut down the system. And it's so funny when you see these big health influencers that are hyper focusing on diet and nutrition, and usually the keto diet. And it's the cure-all to just decrease your eating window and to eat less carbs. They talk about those two things as their cure-all, but actually I think it's the exact opposite. They're a cause-all of all different sorts of conditions. And when you stack that with trying to recover from being slammed by environmental pollutants for your entire life, 20, 30, 40 years, for multiple decades straight, in beauty products and the drinking water and the bathing water and the air that we breathe and the EMFs and the heavy metals that are just ubiquitous in our environment now and in our food supply. It really amazes me that people like to hyper focus on nutrition. I guess it sells because diet books sell, and I don't think diets work. I think we should eat in a balanced way and not try to get in this hyper restricted mindset that just causes more stress and actually causes a rebound in weight gain. So I think the cause of a lot of weight gain and excess cellulite that everyone's freaking out about, that are focused on, like, how do I lose weight fast? It's really by getting out a lot of these environmental pollutants. It's reducing the load, so reducing your exposure to all of these pollutants, and you really have to take an inventory of your entire life. So you have to look at the shampoo and the hair products that you're using, the skincare products. You have to look at your bedding. You have to look at where your bed is placed physically, because if it's on one side of the room versus the other side of the room, your EMF exposure could be double. And that could be suppressing your thyroid function, your digestion, your immune system, your hormonal balance, everything. So really, it's about making these small changes all throughout your life, and that is the ultimate stack. It's not so much about stacking the right supplements, as that is later on down the road, that's advanced, But the more foundational thing is to stop the stuff coming in. Because if you keep flooding your body with, let's just say, aluminum, and you're taking maybe silica, which displaces aluminum, especially in liquid form, then you're just spinning your wheels. You're taking 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and you're not really making progress as you could if you actually started to, install dirty electricity filters, maybe invest in some EMF blocking clothing, start to be more mindful of the air quality and your metal exposure and your hard water exposure, both in transdermal and in oral form, and just started making little changes. And over time, you'll notice a huge shift in your energy, your mood, your body composition. Nutrition can only do so much if you're not changing these other factors. And I really liked what Keith said about transthyretin, the TTP protein, how that's bound to the retinol X receptor. And I was blown away that saturated fatty acids can actually displace transthyretin from thyroid binding protein, TBP. That's incredible to me because there's a huge cult trend right now for the carnivore diet and just all animal foods. And I think that's unhealthy. I think it's unbalanced. There's a bit of neuroticism to it and just orthorexic kind of mindset. But I'm going to be pondering on that for a while because that brings me full circle back to sugar and carbohydrates importance. And if you restrict sugar, then your liver cannot properly detox, your thyroid cannot function properly, you can't make energy in your cells properly, and everything just starts to fall down. As Keith was talking about, the organization of the system starts to fall apart. So it's really about a holistic approach, not restricting macronutrients, eating carbs, proteins, and fats, and not going extreme where you're trying to get all saturated fats or mostly saturated fats in your diet. I think where people get into real trouble is when they're eating tons of nuts and seeds and vegetables and legumes, which are full of polyunsaturated fats, but at the same time, they're keto, so they're restricting carbohydrate/sugar. That is a recipe for disaster because you're bringing in tons of unstable, long chain, easily oxidized, synergized with iron overload, polyunsaturated fatty acids, but you're not consuming the fuel for your liver to actually burn through them and detoxify them and keep your thyroid functioning properly. So check out Keith's work. He can definitely articulate all of this way better than I can. His website is balancedbodymind.com, and he does coaching. He has a membership area. You can donate, and he has blogs and just a ton of really awesome, useful information. I'll also put the link below to the Christopher Exley article that he referenced about autism. And I'll put the article that I found called Environmental Contaminants and Pancreatic Beta Cells. And I thought that was a really cool one because it goes through each endocrine disrupting compound and specifically how it harms the system. So it'll talk about mercury, arsenic, cadmium, and how they affect glucose uptake and metabolism. And a lot of people think, the diabetes is only caused by sugar, but it's actually a more complex story. It's largely caused by the omega-3 supplements and the vegetable oils, which are synonymous toxicity. And it's also caused by the heavy metals and EMFs. And there's so many things that affects our glucose uptake. It's really funny that sugar gets all the blame. And I think there's a lot of wordplay going on, like high fructose corn syrup. Every time I go out to eat, The ketchup that's always served is high fructose corn syrup, and they even sneak PUFAs into the little packaged butter packets that you get. And although these are small, a little high fructose corn syrup with your fries, a little vegetable oil butter here and there, these are bioaccumulators, and they accumulate in your tissues and eventually shut the system down. So it's really death by 1,000 cuts. And from a wider view, these things really lead to calcification, lipofuscin, and fibrosis, like I talk about with my CLF protocol. And if you want to read about that, you can go to matt-blackburn.com, click on blogs, and I have a few articles, one on Shilajit, vitamin E, endotoxin, a few on magnesium, and then my CLF protocol, which kind of breaks down my basic philosophy about health. And if you click shop at the top, you can browse my recommended products. These are all things that I use, my favorite red light therapy devices, my favorite salt, my favorite medicinal mushrooms. I'm still loving that Therasage Thera O3 ozone and negative ion generator. Just bring that with me on trips in the car. And actually, when I get out of the car, in between driving, I'll actually run the ozone feature. And that really freshens up the car, really has an anti-mold effect. And the negative ion generator is what I use most of the time when I'm driving. And that makes such a difference because the AC or the heat just really zap your energy, really robs electrons from your body. So to pump out negative ions in your car while you're driving, it's a pretty harsh environment. You're insulated from the earth, EMFs are intensified, you're breathing recycled air, you're getting kind of filtered in the wrong way, sunlight through the windows, oftentimes blocking the UVB and allowing the UVA, which both are beneficial, but we need them in the proper ratio. So it's just a really rough environment. So anything you can do in your car, like I talked about in my Mitolife Academy, I had a little video on how I mitigate long drives. And I was just talking about a few hours, but a lot of people will drive, they'll go on road trips where they're driving state to state or from area to area, and they're driving for maybe 6, 8, 10 hours a day. That's where it really counts to make these little upgrades and maybe have a little portable molecular hydrogen H2 generator that you're breathing through a nasal cannula. That is huge if you're driving for most of the day from sunups until sundown, like I did when I moved here to Idaho. It's so rough on the body. Even if you have snacks and you're regulating your blood sugar, you really have to be doing the other stuff as well, because it's not fun to get to your destination and just be worn out and exhausted. So check out Mitolife Academy on YouTube to get little health tips, biohacking tips, whatever you want to call it, natural health tips to mitigate the world that we live in and how to still live our life, but not, develop disease, which is what really our culture is steering us towards. And Mitolife is my brand. It's Mitolife. The website is mitolife.co. And I have a pretty good product line going. I have 10 products now. Just released a new one called Resilient C, which is whole food vitamin C. It's a combination of amla fruit, which is a berry, camu berry, and rose hips. And so that actually contains not only ascorbic acid. Ascorbic acid is in there, but that's just a part of vitamin C. So it also contains the tyrosinase enzyme, which contains copper in it, contains J factors, K factors, P factors, ascorbagin, rutin, and the entire complex works together really powerfully on the system, even on the bones, as I'm learning about in a book that I'm reading called Death by Calcium by Thomas E. Levy. And it says on the front, proof of the toxic effects of dairy and calcium supplements. I would cross out the dairy part, but the calcium supplements, absolutely. And he has a whole section where he talks about vitamin C, specifically in the context of skeletal health and calcification. And in the summary, he says vitamin C supplemental results in greater bone density. It lowers fracture risk. It accelerates and improves quality of bone healing. It protects against calcifications. It protects against kidney stones. It lowers all-cause mortality. And it's a frontline defender against oxidative stress. And what's really cool is that C and E work together. And so if you have both of those going on and you're aware of this whole iron piece and that anemia is a joke diagnosis and that the real pandemic is iron overload and iron excess in the tissue and that ferritin test is useless, then you start to see the big picture and you start being more aware of maybe the Berkey water that you're drinking that's full of iron and the supplements that you're taking that have iron in them and the iron filing cereal that you're raised on, the ferrous iron, ferrous dangerous, the harmful form, not ferric iron, that accumulates in the tissues and actually makes you rust from the inside out and turns oxygen that you breathe into a poison. And you get this extreme oxidative stress in the body. So vitamin C and vitamin E are more important than ever, because I would agree with the book that it's the frontline defender against oxidative stress. And it's not really about megadosing both of them, although there's a time and place for that. Not ascorbic acid, but whole food vitamin C and vitamin E, even high dose vitamin E, regardless of all the scare articles, has been used for many years for infertility, for eye issues, for mental disabilities, for hormonal imbalance, all sorts of things. Vitamin E is really powerful for. And I've experimented over the years with high dosing different things. Unfortunately, I high dosed some of the wrong things like algae oil and fish oil and krill oil because I bought the whole omega-3 scam. But then I started looking at elderly people and seeing these age spots on their forehead, on their forearm, the spots that get the most UV exposure. And I started to question my beliefs. And I started to question whether omega-3 fatty acids were essential EFAs. And it came to the conclusion that they're not only not essential, they are harmful to our health because they contribute to lipofuscinosis or yellow fat disease, the terminal toxin, as it's called. And this creates age spots. And you could see brown spots on the skin. This is really a new phenomenon that's blown up because of the vegetable oil scam, the omega-3 supplement scam, which is just as important as the vegetable oils, because you hear all these people talking about industrial seed oils and how those are harmful to your health, like trans fats, but they're not taking on the elephant in the room, which to me is more important than the seed oils. And that is the false belief that we need to supplement fish oil or algae oil or omega-3s. It is the opposite. It's impossible to avoid consuming these because it's in grass-fed beef. It's in eggs. You're going to get omega-3s whether you want to or not, unless you're a breatharian and you don't eat. And that's fine. But if you supplement it, that's where you really contribute to age pigment formation. Also, I just re-released Digestidol and reformulated it. I took out some minerals, the B vitamins. So now it's just very simply a digestive enzyme blend with amla and rutin. So you're getting your bioavailable copper in there. And this enzyme is meant to be taken with food, unlike Dissolvidol. So I sell 3 enzyme products. One is Dairy Absorb. That's good if you've restricted dairy for a while. Maybe you went on a vegan diet and then you realized that dairy contains nutrients that are pretty unique and difficult to get. There's even vegan supplements now that are full of lactoferrin, where you could just go straight to the source and just drink milk to get your lactoferrin, but also your retinol, which has huge implications for liver and thyroid function and iron regulation. So Dairy Absorb is lactase enzyme, and that helps to break the lactose, which is the primary disaccharide sugar found in milk and cheese. And so you can gain the benefits of these superfoods with the lactase enzyme. And Dissolve It All, that was the first supplement that I came out with Mitolife. It's a systemic enzyme blend of nattokinase and serrapeptase primarily. There's also bromelain and papain, lipase and proteases in there. And this one's really powerful for breaking up scar tissue in the body. And that's called fibrin or fibrosis. And whenever we have irritation and inflammation, we have scar tissue, which is called fibrosis. And it's a protective mechanism of the body, but that can get put on overdrive if we're in a state of chronic inflammation, which most of us have been our entire life unknowingly because of environmental pollutants and the iron filings in our cereal that I was raised on, Honey Nut Cheerios and Lucky Charms. And all that stuff, it accumulated in the body, and it's just been this constant bombarding of the tissues. So going in there and breaking up the fibrosis can have really systemic effects on the function of everything, especially the immune system. Systemic enzyme therapy isn't talked about enough when it comes to immune system dysregulation. It's been used for that for many years. But with systemic enzymes, you take them on an empty stomach before meals or in between meals. With Digest It All that I just came out with, you take that with a meal. So they're actually helping you break down your food, which is really helpful if the pancreas has been getting slammed with polyunsaturated fats, if you've been exposed to EMFs. Really every system suffers, and your digestion often is the first thing to go, especially under stress of any kind, psychological or physiological. So check out the Mitolife products. Really appreciate your support. I release a new show every Friday, and don't forget to check out the show notes for some interesting links. See you next week, and stay supercharged.